Thanks for the intro, and thanks to everybody who's joined. I don't know what it's like where you are. I've just escaped from the rain here in Edinburgh, although it's been quite nice lately. But yeah, thanks for the intro. So I'm Craig Cockburn, and people sometimes ask if I'm related to Alistair Cockburn, who's one of the Agile Manifesto co-authors. Well, we might be distantly related, but it's not a very close one. But we do correspond quite frequently because we're in the same area. So this is the talk on visualizing the why of movement, strategy and roadmaps, and dealing with complex situations and strategy. And the background to me is that I have been using Agile for more than 10 years. I also started coaching in Agile about 2011. And I live in Edinburgh, Scotland, but I spent a long time in London, where I was involved in setting up the BCS specialist group for Agile there. And they run an annual conference, which sadly got postponed this year because of COVID, but is hoping to run soon next year. And I'm also involved in community events in Scotland too. And it's nice to be able to speak to Agile evangelists, because early on in my Agile career, when I was living in London, I actually went along to Agile evangelists meetings in Waterloo in London about 9 years ago, and they were some of the first meetings that I went to. So it's quite a privilege to come back and be able to speak to this group and others as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy this talk. I have given it a few times, but for this particular talk, I've made quite a few updates. So even if you have heard it before, there's a bit of new things in it, and hopefully we'll be able to kick off. So feel free to click on the link, connect with me, follow me in social media and Twitter, and there's a hashtag there if you want to use that. Although I do notice that when people are doing things online, then hashtags and social media interaction does go down quite a lot from in-conference talks. But that's my background. And I just wanted to open with a poll to make sure you're all awake and to just see what the kind of level of knowledge of people on the call is. Now, I'm new to Webinar Jam, so hopefully it's all going to work for you. Is there a poll available that you can see? And we've got 47 people on the call, so if I wait, I don't know how many people have answered that, but I don't know how long we need to leave, typically. I'm just pulling the chat window there. Hi, everybody. So that's the poll. It's still changing, so I'll give it another few seconds. Okay, well, it looks like the favoured thing is that people use it sometimes. That's good. Some people use it regularly. A few use it a lot, and some people don't use it at all. Now, it's interesting, and hopefully those people who haven't heard about it much will learn something, and those that use it a lot of the time might also learn something. But it's interesting to see that a lot of people are using it, because one of the preconceived myths is that it's just for senior executives. And I know that from going to a lot of these meetups, that it's not necessarily many senior executives do go to meetups. Often it's the engaged community of coaches that go, and it's not necessarily the people that will benefit from it most that go to these meetups. But that's an interesting response there, that there's quite an even spread there. So if we move on to the rest of it. So just to clarify who I think the audience is for this talk, it's basically anybody who creates a strategy or reviews it or implements it or coaches others anyway. And importantly, it's at any level of the organisation, because I believe, a bit like testing and quality and being interested in customers, is that strategy is something that matters to all of us. And when we do things like Scrum and have a sprint plan, well, that's a strategy for successfully executing a sprint. So even though we don't really call it a strategy, it's an effective way of delivering the sprint goals in an organised way, rather than just picking the top story and delivering it in order. it's a strategy for delivering those goals in a successful way so that we're more likely to meet them. Now, this is the format of the talk. I appreciate for many people this is maybe a lot of new content. So to try and minimize the cognitive load, I've put in some key markers like some contents and a summary and some indications of where we are in the talk to help a little bit of structure. So this is the format, and typically the talk is about 40 to 45 minutes, depending on how quickly I go. And there'll be time for questions at the end. But if anybody is particularly struggling, then of course put something in the chat, because I don't need to be sitting there having a problem, and it'll get flagged up so I can see that quickly. Now, just to start off, where this all began for me, as I say, I help to organise events, but I also go to a lot of events too. I enjoy going to meetups. And I went to a couple of talks, one by Roman Pichler, who wrote a book more than 10 years ago about product ownership. And he mentioned strategy, so I'll show the picture of that later on. But also, I went to a lot of Simon Wardley's talks. I've been to his talk several times. It's very engaging and interesting. And he talks about strategy too. And I went, well, this obviously seems to matter. And they're both talking about strategy, but I can't seem to quite tie the one talk in with the other. So this is where this sort of began, because actually I was working as a coach with some teams, and they were saying, well, that's Simon Wardley talk. It was really interesting. I really get it, but I'm struggling to understand how I can actually implement that in my team. What's the bridge from that talk to the relevancy of our teams, where we work with backlogs and roadmaps? So how do we form a roadmap using a Simon Wardley map? And initially I then wrote a blog article about how to do that, but then that blog article led me on to this, which was a more generic principle. So that's the background as to how this came about, and it was about a year and a half ago. And then I developed this over the course of last summer and presented it last October at Agile Tour London. Now, some kudos to Simon Wardley here, who uses these pictures. And he talks a lot about mapping and indicates this Battle of Thermopalae, which was made famous by the film 300. And in this battle map, it shows that the one side is trying to block the sea in order to force the other side to then fight on land in a narrow strait. And the advantage of doing that was their large numbers then wouldn't be so much of an advantage, because they'd be forced to fight on a narrow front. And here we see the use of a map as a useful way to see contextual moves. Whereas on the right-hand side, we see a lot of traditional project management with a SWOT chart, which is all very well, and it's nice as a bit of a list, but it doesn't really tell you what you should be doing first, or why, or it doesn't really give you a lot of real relevant context as to, well, supposing something changes, what do we do next? So in many ways, Simon Wardley talks about the relevancy and importance of mapping to see things in a clearer, more articulate way, where there's a more complex movement going on. And at the top, I've tried to articulate this as some sort of corporate strategy in everyday language, which is things like, let's be the leading army, or let's set a KPI of 3 battles this year, or let's expand our territory, or let's be in the magic quadrant if such things existed in 480 BC. Now, it's all very well, but it doesn't really tell you how you should fight and win the battle. Now, this is Simon Wardley's example. Interestingly, from this particular battle, it wasn't a conclusive outcome. So I chose a battle with a conclusive outcome, and because I'm Scottish, I chose the Battle of Bannockburn, which was fought over 700 years ago, and we're still singing about it. And in this particular example, the Scots overcame the English, who were actually a far superior and bigger force, and used strategy. And the reason, and the strategy is documented there in those 6 steps. However, importantly, this battle was only 2 days. So what I'm trying to envisage here is that, yes, there was potentially a map, but there was certainly an understanding of the landscape, because that was used to their advantage. But also, being only 2 days, it just reinforces that strategy just isn't for big multi-year things. It can be for quite quick things too. And it can be very effective, so much so that 700 years later, Scots are still singing about this particular victory. So again, a lot of battle thinking and such like coming about here. And we also see, interesting with Agile now, that military thinking is creeping more and more into Agile, because we see red team thinking coming from the military coming into Agile too. And although we think of the military as quite regimented, there's a lot of good books, such as General Stanley McChrystal's Team of Teams, about empowered teams. So it's quite relevant and interesting to see how battle thinking can come effectively into Agile. So first of all, what I want to do is to get you clear that there really is a problem with strategy. And the first thing is about starting with a common language, because back to that team I was working with, I found that they were trying to get things approved. They were trying to get business cases done. They were trying to articulate things like outcomes, but they were going to boards and they were saying this wasn't an outcome. And then when I looked up on the internet, well, what do we mean by an outcome here? The definition was quite vague, and that was creating confusion. So therefore, I said, well, we need to agree a common language. So therefore, for the purposes of this particular talk, these are the key terms that I use. And so this is the language here. And hopefully this is consistent enough with what you have used yourselves. And the strategy is coherent, which means that it makes sense together as a whole, and it's contextual in that it's specific to a particular situation, and it delivers outcomes. And those outcomes are long-lasting things that help you to support realization of a vision, which is a desired future state. So these things all work closely together, and tactics are the things that you do in order to make your strategy successful. And I relate here to some other terms that are also around, just in case you've heard these. So say the vision is realized by the outcomes, but sometimes you hear mission or objectives and they mean pretty much the same sorts of things. So if you think about the man on the moon in the 1960s, the mission was to put a man on the moon, but the vision was the, I suppose, the emotional superiority of the United States, such that the Russians didn't get the emotional victory, and the credibility of the US was actually restored. So really the vision was the kind of emotional state that was the future state, of which the mission was simply a way of achieving that. Outcomes are delivered by strategy. The strategy is supported by the tactics, and progress towards this is measured by key results. So if you're using things like OKRs, outcome and key, objectives and key results, then your measurement of the progress is supported by that as well. And this is how this all sorts of fits together. So a simple to-do list isn't a strategy. Now, I'll talk about cargo cult in a minute. But first of all, this popular phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, which I heard numerous times in numerous talks. And I decided to do my research on this and not just copy and paste it without knowing where it was coming from. But actually, this common phrase wasn't actually said by Drucker. It's been cut and pasted around the place and changed. I think it originally was culture eats strategy. Before that, it was culture beats strategy. And then that came from someone else entirely. So again, trying to avoid cut and paste techniques here, and you can investigate those links there to see the source and story behind this. And I thought that was quite interesting that there was a lot of cut and paste going on there. But actually, the real learning here is not just to cut and paste what other people are saying, but also to recognise that actually the two are complementary. It's not really an either or. They go hand in hand. A culture and a strategy can work very effectively together, and you don't have to choose one or the other. So 7 deadly sins of cargo cult is don't just copy what everyone does without context 7 times over. And which is what I've seen a lot of people saying, oh, this framework worked there, therefore we'll use it here. A bit of management consultancies sometimes do this and assume it will work. And sadly, we see a lot of agile transformations failing. So The bridge, I realise I'm speaking to a lot of people who are not in Scotland, but this particular bridge is based off the coast near Edinburgh and looks a bit ridiculous there in the sea. It's called the Bridge to Nowhere, but at low tide there's a river runs under it and the bridge helps you get from the car park to the nice beach that's on the other side. So the bridge is an example of something that looks ridiculous, but actually in context is very useful. And equally, there are things that are potentially very useful, but in context, they're not very useful at all. So it's getting us to really think about things rather than just take things at superficial value. Now, when I look at strategy in the world out there, we see there's a big long list of failure stories, of which Kodak, Blockbuster, Nokia, Toys R Us are just 4. And the reason I mention those is that those industries still exist and they're still very valuable because we still have cameras, watch films, buy phones, and thankfully buy toys. So the industries are still there, but these 4 companies got massively disrupted out of them because of poor strategy. And interestingly and rather ironically, Nokia made respirators for 60 years, which might have been quite a useful thing to have done and to have remained in that business in the current climate. So it's kind of funny how sometimes companies pivot away from something that ultimately proves to be useful, and sometimes they're just caught and it's too late to change. But that was an interesting bit of history about Nokia that I found when I was doing this research too. They started off as a paper mill and their logo was a salmon because they're beside a river, and ultimately they got into electronics. Similarly with Brexit. Brexit is the process of Britain leaving the EU. And a couple of years ago, somebody posted this popular tweet which relates the Brexit process to waterfall and how sometimes we go far down a route and then realise that the requirements have changed. So just a bit of data to kind of back up what I'm saying here. 97% of executives felt strategy was the most critical leadership behaviour to success. And we see from the previous slides that getting things wrong can lead to organisations going bust or significantly losing market share. And 97% of executives agree, and that's quite a big survey there with 10,000 executives. And similarly, from the Business Agility Institute, again, a lot of data there that it's around about motivating leaders. It's around the lack of agile mindset, unclear or changing vision, and limited support. These are typical things why particularly agile transformations fail. I appreciate there's a little bit of wordiness in these slides. Now, I'm not Steve Jobs, so I know Steve Jobs does slides with like 2 or 3 words and everybody thinks they're fantastic, but I don't like him have a marketing team behind me to explain all the products. So if you're struggling, then the wordiness of the slides also helps neurodiversity, because not everybody likes to learn by listening. Some people like to learn by seeing and reading. So it's there for your information. You can ponder that later, and there's links for more information. But there certainly is a lot of failure going on, and I put together an article there. So I'll then talk you through it. There's a lot of data on why agile transformations don't always succeed as well. And again, it's a lot of lack of effective leadership, lack of respect for culture change, and there's a fair amount of patterns going on there. I'm thinking, well, surely we can do something about this. So scoot on a little bit to the next poll to ask you, how often do you feel your strategy is updated? And the poll should be in the webinar jam window. Well, it's quite interesting that there's a fair number of people say they don't have one. You can just give it another few seconds, see the numbers stop moving. Okay, well, maybe stop there and talk. There's interesting data there because we've got 15% say they don't have one, 25% say they don't know. So that's 40% may well either don't have a strategy or it's not being articulated properly. And yeah, I've just covered how a lack of strategy or a poor strategy is terrible, is really significant. So that's 40% there. And we've also got about a third saying it's updated about once a year, and only 17% saying more than once a year. Now, it's obviously going to depend on the industry that you're in, but in an increasingly volatile and uncertain world, perhaps we should be updating strategy more often. So now on to the Agile strategy and Agile context here. This is from a PI planning session I did, where we were looking at about 3 months worth of work. And it was a massive tickets, as you can see in the background. And again, it's like, well, how do we make sense of that? It really gets me thinking. There needs to be some sort of context for how to organise a long list of to-dos that comes out of a planning session. Now, I'm not sort of here to evangelise SAFe, but I was interested, as SAFe does seem to be the most popular scaling framework, as to what it did, because unlike other frameworks, SAFe does go into a lot of detail about other things, you know, and it's got quite a detailed website. So I was just interested to see what does it actually say, because it's really trying to help executives a lot, but actually it recognises that, similar to what I've said, you've got people not really agreeing on what it is and having different opinions, and there's poor discipline here. So SAFe's quoting this and recognising it's a problem, and within SAFe, we recognise that there's some changes needed on the left, where apparently we're navigating between some cones, and some market dynamics happening that might make our strategy change. And I'm afraid that that seems to be about as much as SAFe goes into in terms of detail, with a little bit of an explanation of what strategy is. So sadly, for the most widely adopted scaled framework that goes into the most in terms of business agility, the content there is still sadly quite light. So hopefully this will help. So the next poll, of those people using strategy, or everybody, what do you think of strategy, and are you using it in a useful way that actually helps you in your day-to-day job? Let's go into the chat. Give it another few seconds. Okay, well, it looks like the numbers have solidified around there, so carry on answering if you wish, but it's interesting to see that again, roughly, we've got never, don't have a strategy at 9% and rarely at 28%. So again, similar numbers to before, about 40% not really using strategy and not aware that there is. So again, you know, that's an interesting figure, that about 40% roughly, certainly over a third, aren't really using strategy very much to help them in the day-to-day jobs. Whereas I said earlier, you know, I believe this is for everybody, and also even just doing a sprint plan is a type of strategy at a team level. And only 22% say usually. So bring in some more context here, particularly for the Agile world. And this is the bit that I got off of Roman Pichler, who gave me this content. So to explain how things fit together, the company vision in the top circle informs the business strategy, and the business strategy informs the product strategy, but the company vision also informs the product vision, and the product vision then informs the product strategy. So the product strategy is implementing the business strategy, and trying to deliver the product vision. That's how the things fit again in the circle at the top, and the four circles at the bottom are trying to show that there's a vision which informs the product strategy, which informs the product roadmap, which is typically things that you do over maybe a 6 to 12 months rough timescale. And then from that roadmap, it then helps you to organise your backlog so the teams know what to work on in the near term. And this then refers back to that big safe wall with all those stickers of, if you've got a roadmap, it can then help you to organise those to-do lists for major deliverables. But of course, the roadmap needs to come from somewhere, which is the strategy, and the strategy is then there for a purpose, which is to deliver the vision. So this is where Roman Pichler was coming from. But I then tried to tie it in, as I say, with Simon Wardley's talk about patterns of strategy and how do you actually form it. It's all very well banding the word around, but what do you mean and how do we build one? So this is the strategy cycle that Simon Wardley uses, and it's also closely related to the John Boyd OODA loop. And John Boyd was a fighter pilot between 1945 and 1975 in the US military, who spoke about this observe, orient, decide, act cycle, and said that if you as a pilot can go through that cycle quicker than your opponent, you're more likely to win a fight in the air. So he promoted that, but also this strategy cycle comes from Sun Tzu, which is about, again, battle strategy. So interestingly, and to break this down, the purpose is why bother at all? So if imagine this was chess, is, well, why play chess? You might like it, you might want to just increase your brain power, you might have fun doing it, you might just be competitive. And then after you get through that purpose of why bother, the rest of it is the context-specific moves, which is, this is the way the board is laid out right now, so the best move is going to depend on the board layout. So that's the more context-specific thing. So the why of purpose is, why do this at all? And the why of movement is, why do we do this move now? Based on all the other moves that might be open to us. The landscape is generally things that don't change very much, we just have to work with it. Like in battle strategy, the climate is things that can alter the landscape. So in Battle of Bannockburn, if it rained, the landscape would become boggy and things would change. Doctrine is things that you can apply, different patterns, beliefs, practices and so on. And leadership is then the act of deciding what to do and being the leader that then people can then get behind. So there's a cycle, and then you just keep cycling around that depending as much as you need. This is the same thing represented in a slightly different way, so you can see the cycle on the right, but also how this relates to things like value chain, tactics, and the types of activities that you do at each particular point. But a lot of this is about understanding, why do this at all? Why is this a valuable thing to do? And then looking at and understanding and taking in what's going on in your own context to then realise, what do you believe will be the next best move? Unfortunately, in real life, the compelling story of why is missing. There are often to-do lists. We miss off having committed people and the effect this has on people. I said earlier that culture and strategy weren't mutually exclusive. And also importantly, when you look at the Agile Manifesto too, the values are about individuals and interactions and customer collaboration, and they're about people. So although it was written by 17 software engineers, half the value statements are actually about people. And sometimes we miss off people in our strategies. And also in line with the poll that you filled in earlier about how often some people update their strategy in a cadence, but I also think that whilst a cadence is useful, we should update it when things change, because when things change, your existing strategy may not be relevant anymore. But sadly, in the big companies I've often worked in, which will remain nameless, often strategies sit in a slide deck and don't change for 5 years and come in line with a chief executive who's new, a strategy is developed, it sits there until the next chief executive comes in a few years later and then comes up with a new one. So a slight diversion off here into psychology for a minute, and this is from Ian McLaren Wallace, who won an award in psychology and often appears on TV. And this is his analysis of how we process information, because if we're forming a strategy and making a decision, first of all, the landscape changes, as I've said. We need to understand that and process that information, but we're also dealing with the fact that we're learning as we go. The information in our heads and the models in our heads are also evolving. And so therefore, there's all these 12 different states here of evolving external information and unfamiliar things in our heads that become familiar, in order then that we can process that information effectively in order to make good decisions. So with all these different states of unknown going on, it's a bit strange how we can assume a fixed strategy when both the landscape is changing and also our understanding and being able to process it is also changing. So our step through now a little bit of a worked example of how I came about a way to visualize strategy. And I used Brexit because it was a nice, simple thing to handle. Well, actually, I'm being a bit sarcastic there. It was really complicated. And it was changing the whole time. So I decided that if it's going to work for Brexit, it'll work for more simple situations. So first of all, in analysing Brexit, this is about a year ago. So obviously, Britain has now left the EU, but a year ago it was a mess and nobody had a clue what was going on. And you could ask lots of people and get lots of different opinions. And it's very difficult to synthesise that information to really understand what would happen next. So the motives for Brexit are there. That's why bother at all. The landscape was the aspects that weren't really changing very much, and just had to kind of work with that. The climate, which is the next part of this diagram, was things that were changing, which was a year ago. Things were evolving, the clock was running down, the government about August lost its majority, so that made things much more complicated. There was legal action on the go, and Parliament was dissolved and then recalled again, and there was a lot of propaganda misinformation. So what would happen is that you'd see a lot of analysis of this on the TV, but actually you just end up with a whole load of different opinions. Mm-hmm. As a product owner, you need to be able to synthesize these different opinions to go, well, what do we actually think is going to happen, and what makes sense to go next, and how do you bring all those different opinions together? So a gentleman called John Worth put this together and evolved this. Now, this is from last April, so it's more than a year old now, but it shows a level of complexity, which is why it was difficult for people to really understand what was going on. But with his domain-specific knowledge in politics, he could analyse the processes and the numbers and then say, this is what I believe is going to happen, and there's some rough timescales on that, and there's some kind of outcomes at the bottom. And I went, well, that's quite useful. I can now start to understand what the process is here. And a bit like a weather forecast, it's not giving me certainty, but it's giving me an analysis of actually, it says 49% general election at the bottom there, and that is actually what ultimately happened. So there was a lot of analysis put in there. Now, what I'm bringing here is a facilitation technique. I can't come in and write your strategy because it requires domain-specific knowledge, but the two go together to produce something useful. And this map did prove remarkably useful, but I figured it needed a few changes to be better useful for Agile teams. So if you turn it on its left-hand side and then look at the different goals that were on the map and then evaluate the pathways to those goals, you then discover risks and different options. And then you can formulate your strategy from that. Now, to me, this is what I would call proactive Agile. It's about being able to see ahead sufficiently and also recognize there might be more than one way of achieving your objective. Because we often think of Agile as being able to turn on a dime for a dime, which is nice because something's happened and we can react to that quickly, and that's useful. But sometimes it's already too late. So we want to be able to see sufficiently far ahead and plan at a high level, because detailed planning is wasteful. But we also want to recognize where things might change to if they do change. Therefore, we're ready. So we've got a plan B in our back pocket. And there's often nothing that was challenged to the government is what's your plan B, but they didn't seem to have one. So proactive Agile is about trying to anticipate things so you're ready if they change. And so this diagram on its side, the green sort of dots represented a particular outcome, which was revoke Brexit. And you could do this if you wanted Brexit to happen, and you could look at, say, in order to bring about the outcome that I want on the right, what is the pathway that takes me there? And for the good outcomes, there was at least 2 different pathways, which was interesting. Some took us into risky territory, which was also interesting. And sometimes these pathways diverged, which was a particularly risky point, because then you might end up, if you are not careful, down the wrong pathway. But then working backwards from that pathway, the strategy is then formed on the left-hand side by walking the pathway, which, in the case of revoking Article 50 and staying in the EU, it was get an extension, negotiate a deal, which meant there was a people's vote, secure that vote and then win, because the only 2 outcomes with this was Brexit happens or it doesn't. And using this sort of map, it went, well, that's quite useful, because now with that map, I can then see what I need to do next. But unlike a conventional flowchart, this isn't static. You don't just follow the flowchart. You recognise that every time you reach one of the next steps on this particular map, things will then be different and need to remap. And what John Worth did is he updated this sometimes several times a month, because that was how fluid the situation was. And you know, it was a fair amount of work, and he got a lot of analysis and coverage of this. But basically, this is the steps to do it. You look at the kind of diagram there. You devise your roadmap, the roadmap being the steps that you're wanting to follow, and then that forms the roadmap. And then from that roadmap, you can devise what to do next, or in an Agile context, you devise your backlog. But interestingly, unlike a lot of conventional strategies, you can actually see what your opponents are trying to do, which is absolutely critical in business. So you can visualize your opponent's strategy in the same map. You can then say, we're now doing this because we believe our opponents are doing that. Therefore, we should be doing this now to stop them getting an advantage. So starting to see now how the context of strategy is actually influenced by where you believe your opponents are, what you believe they might do next. So, and then if he did probabilities, now that's actually quite a lot of work, and it's obviously going to be subject to a fair amount of margin of error. But interestingly, you could just say, well, high probability, medium probability, low probability. But you could look at that and go, well, actually, if we're on a low probability route, perhaps we should do something to increase the probability of delivering the outcome that we want. Now, I thought this was interesting, and I gave this talk last October when Brexit hadn't happened. But now that it has, we can now look back at these maps that were published on Twitter in real time, and for the whole of the year, they were correct, which is quite an astonishing thing for something so complicated and fast-moving, in that the major series actually predicted successfully what would happen next. And then this made me realise that even in something as complicated and as fast-moving as Brexit, you can deduce an analysis of it that is then useful, because this was correct at 4 different stages, and it predicted to an appropriate horizon. So therefore, it wasn't predicting the whole of the year, it was predicting to a certain level, because beyond that, it was just too unpredictable. The foreign press loved this. It was covered extensively, but it was widely ignored in the UK, which was quite odd. So there's a lot of partisan politics sadly in the UK, and sometimes speaking to partisan people, you simply get their point of view rather than the analysis of what they think will genuinely happen next. So in order to actually apply this in a more relevant and simple land that we may be working with, I devised this template out of that Brexit map to see if this would help people visualize what they're doing. And so I put situational context on the left, because this is the relevant things that have happened that brought us to this point. So we make context-specific moves. An advantage moves up. And you'll see how this works in a minute, because and time moves from left to right. So therefore, unlike a Wardley map, you can see what's going to happen first. Now, there's 5 areas on this playing field, because I think of it a bit like a game of football or rugby, in which if you know, back in the days when we used to have sports, although it's coming back now, and you get the analysis at half time, you could see the stats of how long an opponent was playing in particular halves. So therefore you could see if they had a tactical advantage, which is interesting, but it doesn't win you the game. Whereas scoring a goal does contribute to winning the game. One goal might be enough, but you still have to win more goals than your opponent. So I realised from this that actually this maps really well onto product roadmaps, because advantage is non-linear. And this is a really key learning, is that you can do internal things which give you a tactical advantage, like DevOps, but they're really only a practical use when you deploy something. We've now deployed this product sooner because we've got DevOps. So the tactical advantages are things that are internal, and the tactical gains are things that then start to change the landscape. So such as delivery of a product, which is a real bankable win. You're first to the market. You can then set how that market is going to evolve, which is really good. And therefore, the tactical advantage section is about internal benefits, which put you in a better position. And the top is the tactical gains, which are kind of the bankable wins, like scoring in a game of football. But the important thing here is that as soon as you've delivered a product, like Apple delivered the iPad, it's out there, it's public, everybody knows it, and then everybody can copy it. So not long after Apple put out the iPhone, great product, people copied it. Apple put out the iPad, great product, people copied it. So as soon as you're putting out a product, the landscape then changes. So therefore your move then depends on what the reaction to that is. And that's why I see this as a non-linear thing. But if I work through a simple example to show how this actually happens, I was working in an Agile transformation, and you start on the now at the left from a position of disadvantage, which is we were waterfall, and we perceived that that was a problem and we wanted to change. So therefore, later on, there was some rolled out new job titles like product owner and scrum master and agile coach and so on. And then up in the top, there was a deliverable. Yes, we've done it. We're all rolled out. So therefore, that leads to us being transformed. And that was the sort of plan in a two-dimensional format. And that looked all very well, although sadly, it was a little bit more like this. So the roles were rolled out, and people went, what's this all about? Is my job going away? Am I going to need retrained? Oh, we've used up the training budget. What's going on? Is this work going to be canned? This is just a proxy for job cutting, isn't it, really? And so all this fear and distrust then set in. And if you don't do anything about that, then you get this sort of entrenched resistance of, well, I can see this Agile is useful, but it's not really for me, and I'll just take it as slowly as I like because it's going to do me out of a job. So, and this is the sort of type of reaction that sometimes causes Agile transformations to take years and years and meets lots of entrenched resistance. So this is more like the reality, which then leads to entrenched failure states that are then very difficult to budge when people have distrust because they're not then listening to your message. So this optimism and this reality show two very different pictures visually in a two-dimensional format. Now, if a conversation was had at this point of this is what we're proposing to do and then something going to be rolled out, by making this visual and inviting feedback, somebody would say, I don't think that's going to work. I think you're being too optimistic. Perhaps you're doing an experiment. Or I was in another company and it didn't work for us. We met with entrenched failure. And so you're then having this conversation of, I think you're being too optimistic. Perhaps we should do it differently because you don't want that to happen. So the reality is probably going to be a bit more like that. And this is where I see things evolving to, is rather than a linear, we'll just do the sequence of events. You're recognizing that actually some things will take us to positions of advantage and some might not. But by visualizing both things that might go well and things that might go badly, you can then devise what you think you will do. So for instance, I would say, all right, you've got those old job roles. Let's bring in a pilot group and pilot the new roles. And then at that point, you then evaluate, well, how did that pilot of those new roles go? If it went well, you then expand the pilot. But if it didn't go well, change the approach. And then you've got those two different strategies in your back pocket, depending on which one happens. And you can actually then facilitate a conversation around optimism of how well do you think this will go, so that then you can adopt the right risk-averse approach or reflect backwards when things didn't go well of, oh, we're actually a bit optimistic there, or maybe we weren't adventurous enough. And you can actually then reflect on how you're dealing with the conversation of your approach and developing what you should do in advance if it doesn't work. So that's the kind of approach. And to build out a strategy, there's a whole lot of tactics, like future perspectives, future press releases, but also this red team thinking, which is about, well, if things go really, really badly, what is the really bad end state, and therefore what's the predecessor states? So you can map those on the board to then work out, are we on that path already, or where does it diverge from the optimism path? So therefore, what should we do to be cautious when these paths diverge to stop us going down the wrong path? And that way you're visualizing both good and bad outcomes and clearly avoiding the bad ones by seeing the steps that would take you there. And again, I plan to a realistic horizon because of the complexity. You don't want to plan too far, and just try to connect up the present to the future, because you've already got your outcomes in mind, but there may be more than one way of achieving them. And also just to understand, like, it's about people that make these things happen. So who are the main actors and lines of influence? And again, it's all about just regularly inspecting and adapting, because these points on the map are the points where you should reflect, because then you've done something internally and the system's probably adjusted at that point. So this is really about facilitating a conversation around optimism, around optionality, around using Agile values of transparency and openness and collaboration to see if this really makes a difference, because as I said at the start, often we're not very good at strategy and things don't go very well. Just to touch on Cynefin for a minute, because Cynefin's a complexity framework, and within Cynefin, if it's clear, then everybody kind of knows what to do. So you don't really need to use this level of planning. If it's complicated, then it's quite predictable. So therefore, again, your strategy might be quite simple and straightforward. If it's complex, that's typically the space in which a lot of Agile sits, particularly the green area between complex and complicated. You've got enough vision in the complex area to see and act in a straightforward way. This is where strategy is particularly useful. But if it's chaotic, as it says there, just act, sense, respond, there's no point in planning. So it's about, as I say, strategy works better in the complex area. And I see also Dave Snowden is now coming up with a sort of more flowchart approach of dealing with complexity. So although flowcharts have been around for a long time, maybe have a bit of a bad press, but they're actually quite useful in terms of informing good decision making. So that's the explanation there. I've just sort of talked through about where strategy is perhaps most useful in the complex domain. And when you then have a map, you're then reflecting on the situation then. And it might even make sense on strategy to just indicate the Cynefin domain so that you've got a level of understanding of how far ahead it is you should plan. Just to touch on this, a few Google strategy maps. There's been a few attempts at these in the past. I'm not the first to come up with the term, but a professor or emeritus professor even of leadership at Harvard came up with the strategy maps. But when I looked it up, it was quite old schoolish. So it was probably quite good at the time. But this blog article is from 2000, and I kind of think that although it may well have been quite good at the time, we've sort of moved on a little bit more in terms of thinking and Agile since then. So it's useful to know that this is a thing that people have been struggling with for a while, and I'm trying to just update things and make them more Agile and collaborative. Now, Wardley maps, I mentioned Simon Wardley at the start of this talk, and they visualize movement in relation to technical maturity, because they say things like things come from Genesis, then they become bespoke development, then they become productized, and then they become utilities. And when something becomes utility, it's then ripe for disruption. And that's the kind of x-axis in the Wardley map, and the y-axis is value stream. And they're very useful, and I'm not trying to displace them at all, but the Wardley map can inform you of perhaps where you should attack or play, and then from the Wardley map, you can then decide what your strategy can then be, because you're looking for the outcomes and the vision that supports the delivery of that. But you don't necessarily need the Wardley map, because strategy is about things that are more general than just technical maturity. I just see this as a visualization practice, like a Kanban board. So here's the work, and this is why we're doing it. Simon Wardley also talks about this crossing the river by feeling the stones, which is a quote from Deng Xiaoping, and there's the YouTube. But to bring it all in, I tried to draw the river and the stones on my map to kind of give you the flavour for this is how things are, is that we start from one position on one side of the river and we navigate by feeling and sensing and responding to the other side. And to kind of bring it all together and sum it up, I see that proper strategy is supported by effective leadership who can anticipate to a certain degree what's going to happen, and who support people and articulate outcomes and respect culture. And culture is led by the leadership because they have to go first. And agility is about responding to complexity. And lean often goes with agile, but I say that lean is actually more in the complicated domain, which is very relevant in many contexts, particularly where things are predictable. But I see it as a slightly different skill set. So lean is about improving things that you know. Agile is about improving things that you don't know, where things are changing quickly. And leadership is the top of the tree, where you're bringing it all together and leading people. So I think that these three things all have to really interrelate quite closely. And the kind of summary of this talk is just really, these are the key things that I see as being important that maybe we're just not doing enough. So avoid to-do list, understand context, plan sufficiently high ahead rather than 5 years. Try to get a shared understanding, because we saw earlier in the polls, not everybody knows whether there's a strategy or what they should do about it. And by making things visible, you're then inviting feedback and trying to minimize groupthink, because if everybody thinks the same way, there's perhaps something important somebody's missed. And of course, in Agile, we review and reflect. So that's the sort of key 9 steps. But I then brought it together to say, here's some advantages of doing it this way as opposed to any other way that I know of, which is a bit more linear. And these are what I see as some of the key advantages. Now, not all of these might be relevant in your particular context, but by articulating it as a 2-dimensional map, you're clearly bringing much more information. You're showing optionality. You're very importantly showing where you think your opponents might be going and doing, therefore what you should be doing when to stop their success, if that's what you're trying to do. And also things like unexploited opportunities. If you've got a vision you're aiming towards, but there's no outcomes supporting that, or there's no paths leading to those outcomes, again, it's just making things visible in a more articulate 2-dimensional format. And pivot points, as I say, like if there's more than one way of achieving something, and your first way is blocked because something unexpected happened, you've already got that pivot ready to bring out, rather than have to plan it from scratch. And importantly, at the bottom, it's strategy is an ongoing collaboration. And by collaborating in an open and transparent way, we might avoid some of those problems that I said earlier. So a bit of further reading. Here's some of the content I drew on to pull this together. The Declaration of Interdependence, I mentioned Alistair Cockburn at the start, one of the Agile Manifesto co-authors. He wrote the Declaration of Interdependence after the Agile Manifesto, and it talks about strategy. It's not so well known as the Agile Manifesto, but it's interesting that after the software engineers got together to write the manifesto for Agile software development, they immediately started thinking about management and strategy, although they didn't quite get the traction, sadly, that the Agile Manifesto got. It's now doing Heart of Agile, which is much more about people and culture. So is Management 3.0. And again, these things are, I think, gaining in prominence a lot more now. So that's my contact details at the bottom. And that's the talk. So I'm quite happy to take questions, and I'm interested in your feedback as well.
Amazing. Thanks, Greg. Thank you very much. We've got a lot of feedback actually on the chat, and there are 2 questions now that probably you can read on your own, just clicking on chat, and there are marked with the red
Okay.
Q.
So if I take this from the top, just go through the ones marked as questions at the minute. How often do you advise to review a company's strategy versus the business strategy versus the product strategy? Well, I think that there's a usefulness in setting up a cadence if you need to bring together the right people. I mean, that's useful, but I don't think it's sufficient, because as I showed in that Brexit thing, things are changing sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, and therefore you go, right, there's been an event, we now know that things are different. So if you've got a product strategy that was to maybe bring out a new product and suddenly your competitors have brought out something similar, you might want to go, or maybe postpone the launch and add something. So it's really about context, and it's about, is the strategy that we've got right now the best strategy because something's different? So I'd always advise that, you know, you should update it when something significant changes in the external world that affects the likelihood that your current strategy will be successful. The next question was about future perspective. Well, future perspective is there's future perspective, and there's also what's it called, pre-mortem, and they're kind of opposites. A retrospective is where, you know, I would say at the end of a sprint, you've had a sprint, you look back and go, how did that sprint go? So it's a look backwards to see what happened and how you might improve. And a future perspective is just imagining that you're in the future. So imagine the future 6 months from now, and you built and launched your successful product. You could write the successful press release for that, which would then help to motivate people as they go. But to plan that future state and to get people thinking about that future state and what that really means, and to make it real, you're then saying, right, if that's the real future state we can all mobilize and motivate around, what is the preceding state that made that happen? What's the preceding state that then made that happen? So it's like 5 whys that you sometimes get in retrospectives. You're going 5 steps backwards in retrospective with 5 whys to say, what is the sequence of action that then made this thing happen? With a future perspective, you're just doing the same thing in the future. What is the 5 steps from that future working backwards that would make that future more real, or more likely to happen? So you're then planning that sort of roadmap by starting at the end and then working backwards. And that's future perspective from a positive point of view. And the pre-mortem is the something's gone really badly, and then you're looking at the 5 steps that made that happen really badly. Now, we use this in red teaming. I was on a course in red teaming in March, in which we were looking at an anonymous car company that was trying to deal with COVID, and their plants were in China and their supply chains were disrupted. So we said, well, what would be the pre-mortem for that? It was maybe like the worst scenario if the car company goes bust. So therefore, what's the step before that? What's the step before that? What's the step before that? So we planned an imaginary future and then said, well, of this imaginary future, where are we now? And then we realised that we were actually further down that road than we realised, and it was actually quite worrying, and it made it real to say, well, actually, this is maybe not the best thing, should perhaps pivot and do something about it. And I think that sometimes we should be doing things more like that, like, say, climate change, what is a disastrous outcome, and where are we, and how far down that road are we? So therefore, it drives the imperative to act sooner before you end up in that burning platform. So that's a future perspective and related pre-mortem tactic. And that's the only questions I can see. Is there anything else that anybody wants to ask me?
There are actually a few questions on a Q&A mode.
Is there? Oh, wait a minute. If I go to Q&A mode.
Monica.
If I go to Q&A mode. All right. So I see. So I'm now in Q&A, right? So can I share thoughts on balancing regular strategy updates versus perceived as headless chickens, or allowing time to see if the plans are working? Okay. So I think, well, at the outset, I would say that strategy is for everybody. So what you're trying to avoid here is going too far down the wrong route. And trying to support those conversations before they become cast in stone, as it were. So, you know, what I've seen in the past is the C-suite would maybe proverbially lock themselves in a cupboard, say, come up with a strategy, publish it on the internet, and then there it is. And somebody go, I don't quite agree with that. And by the time that's come out, it's then a bit late, and you're then challenging the senior executives, and that's always really difficult. So really, I think that the essence here is if you involve people early, then it's an easier conversation to have. So, the headless chicken mode is about, if you can make things visible, you're then realizing more transparently that there's a problem, because not only have you made it visible, but you've also made the adverse outcomes visible. So therefore it becomes much more obvious that you're on the wrong path. And by making things obvious, then is a spur to act. Now, you can't obviously force people to act, but the more obvious something is, but like a Kanban board with lots of congestion on it, the more transparent a problem becomes, the more it's, I suppose, it's driving the imperative for people to act on it. So, and again, allowing time to see if plans are working. Well, if you need the time to see if it works, again, as I mentioned earlier, things like key results. So say, how do we ascertain that things are going in the right direction? So Dave Snowden gives a talk on how to manage in a crisis, and using COVID as the example. So in a really complex situation, it's very difficult to manage the work because there's too much of it, there's too much diversity, it's moving too quickly. So what you want to do is to manage the constraints of the work. And then by managing the constraints, you can then sort of ascertain what effect that's having on the whole system. So you want some way of saying, what are the constraints of the system? What constraints are we able to move? Because if you can't move them, there's no point messing with them. And then as we move them, what is the mechanism for determining if that's successful? So we can validate it's the right thing. And if it is successful, how do we scale that up? So it's really about understanding, I suppose, what can you affect in the system, and what is the mechanism by determining if that's successful? Because if you don't have a mechanism, then you're potentially wasting money by going down the wrong route for too long. So hopefully that.
3 more questions, Greg.
Yeah, I think for time, how can we be almost sure to choose the correct pivot points? Well, I guess there's no such thing as a crystal ball, right? But by inviting feedback and transparency, it's more likely to be right because you're drawing on the wisdom of teams, and the wisdom in the collective room is probably better than the wisdom of the few. So I'm not going to be able to guarantee that you can choose the correct pivot points, but it's more likely that you will see the pivot points or know where they are. And I think I've answered the next one already in the earlier section about how often do you advise reviewing it and the future perspective. So I think is that me answered them just now? Is there any others that I've not answered?
I think Roberta probably is the last one in Wasim.
Just go down to the bottom.
Yeah.
I can't see that.
Wasim is asking, can you share thoughts on balancing regular strategies updates versus perceived as a headless chicken or
Yeah, so that's what I was saying about just allowing time to see if they're working well. Again, it's about having those relevant key results. So there's teams putting stats out every day. So it depends on the context, really. You want to, in a very, very complex situation, you want to be able to deduce data almost in real time. Now, in Scrum, we have a retrospective every sprint, preferably, and that's typically every few weeks, or at least one sprint a month. Now, Scrum doesn't say you can only have a retrospective once a sprint. You could have a retrospective every day. You could have a real-time retrospective like they do conferences. And in highly complex situations, the idea of having a sensing framework so you can understand the things as they happen rather than relying on people's memory 2 weeks later is actually a perfectly valid thing. So rather than allowing time, it's actually a good thing, the more complex the situation, to set up a sensor network so people can report in real time what's happening, what they were observing, and then finding out a way of collating that and determining the pattern of the landscape. And I think that's actually quite a good tactic, rather than at the end of a 2-week sprint saying, how good's your memory? If you're getting that in real time, you're getting it faster, and then you can deduce things faster as well.
One more question, Greg. Last one is from Roberta. Following up the chart is important, I would say it is that department, supply chain, innovation, finance.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Have their own strategy. Well, I was thinking that every strategy is going to be context specific. Now, we talk about alignment a lot in Agile, and I noticed that Dave Snowden talks about coherent a lot, and I've used the word coherent a lot because I think that alignment sometimes has images of everybody doing the same thing. Somebody showed me a plate of spaghetti once, and everything was aligned, and so all the spaghetti was straight, and that was like, no, that was very well aligned. But the coherent plate of spaghetti was just all sitting there like being a plate of spaghetti. So coherent sort of makes sense altogether. And I think that, as I touched on with the Roman Pichler example, is that things should be coherent together. So it's perfectly relevant to have a different strategy, provided it's contributing to the overall total. Because what you want to do is to eliminate obvious gaps. You want to eliminate obvious overlaps. And you want things to be consistent and coherent with one another. So again, every company strategy is going to be different and specific to them, but the overall company is going to have overall corporate goals that it might be reporting to shareholders or wider stakeholders, and therefore what the strategies are need to be consistent with one another. And of course, these departments are going to be corresponding to one another. So it does make sense to have a sort of higher level view that then sets the agenda for these lower level strategies to fit into. This is where OKRs can be quite a useful tactic, because you're specifying a more generic outcome rather than saying, this is the work you have to do. You're asking, this is the work, this is the outcome I'm seeking from you. You now organize yourselves to deliver that outcome in a self-empowered way.
Greg, I have another request from a guy from Italy that asked to translate a question that he doesn't speak English.
Okay.
To some extent, a strategy might be shared, and to which level? And I mean, you should share your strategy with teams, only executives at any level.
Yeah, well, I believe in the Agile principle of transparentness and openness, and this is part of Kanban as well. But you obviously have to be very careful that you don't want your strategy falling into the wrong hands, because then that gives your opponent a key advantage. Now, so there's a balance to be struck there, and particularly I think that with the Brexit example is that people would sometimes do things in public to make it look as if they were doing something, but actually they'd have a private strategy, and sometimes about trying to deduce that was actually the key skill. So really it's about a relevant level of sharing, depending on sensitivity, and you might want to put out potentially a false strategy to kind of mislead your opponents. It's all very cloak and dagger sometimes, particularly in the cut and thrust world of product management. But I'd say that the default principle should be, as much as possible, transparency and openness, because that way you're then inviting collaboration and feedback, and that's probably going to lead to a better strategy because you've got more wisdom to draw on.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you to everyone, guys, for attending this webinar once again on You Make This Community Amazing. See you next time, guys. See you, Greg, and thanks for...
Okay, and the slides are going to be available for download.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks very much, then.
See you guys.